Hello and welcome to my channel. All the stories here are real. I don't create them using AI or any other tools. The events are absolutely genuine, although sometimes the names of the main characters might be changed. Today, I've prepared two stories for you that are both shocking in their brutality and thought-provoking. I'll break down each case in detail, the facts, the motives, and, of course, the fates of those involved in these tragic events. Today, we'll examine an exceptionally rare and chilling case. The autopsy revealed something so shocking that even seasoned experts involved in the investigation were stunned by what they saw. This case was unusual to such an extent that even specialists, accustomed to handling the most horrifying incidents, couldn't believe that such a thing was possible. And it all started on what seemed to be an ordinary evening at the office. The events took place on the 4th of February, 2011, the last day of the Lunar New Year holidays in Korea. In one of the companies based in Goseong, a city located in the Gyeongsang Province, employees who had to work on the holiday decided to host a small gathering to mark the end of the festive season. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, everyone gathered at a restaurant. Among those attending were 38-year-old Kim Minseok and his peer, Park Jiyeon. Although they both worked at the same company, their relationship was casual at best. They worked in different departments, and their interactions were limited to brief encounters. That evening, they were about to spend time together, but no one could have predicted where it would lead. The dinner party unfolded in a warm and relaxed atmosphere. Colleagues laughed, talked, and enjoyed the festive table, which lasted until the restaurant's closing, around 11:40 in the evening. According to the employees present, many of them, including Kim Minseok, drank much more than usual. Kim, for instance, consumed 3 bottles of soju, a quantity far beyond his typical limit, leaving him visibly intoxicated. Park Jiyeon also appeared to have overindulged. She was so drunk that she could barely stand. As the dinner ended and the employees began to leave the restaurant, a minor incident occurred. Park Jiyeon stumbled on the stairs, falling and scraping her face, leaving a bruise on the right side. Kim Minseok decided not to leave her alone and took the initiative, offering to help and walk her to his room, located about 20 minutes away from the restaurant. Some sources initially claimed that the pair headed to a motel. However, it was later clarified that this wasn't entirely accurate. The building was actually used as a dormitory for company employees, and this is where Kim Minseok's room was. When they reached the room, another employee, Lee Chan-seok, was already there. Kim Minseok asked him to leave and go to another room, and so Kim Minseok and Park Jiyeon remained alone. Several hours passed after Kim Minseok brought Park Jiyeon to his room. Around 4 in the morning, the building's owner, doing a nightly round, heard strange noises coming from Kim Minseok's room. It wasn't just the sound of water. It was as if the faucet was turned on full blast, creating a strong stream that could be heard through the door. The owner wondered if someone had forgotten to turn off the tap in a hurry, and now water was flowing uncontrollably, potentially leading to significant expenses. To avoid unnecessary costs, he decided to use the master key to check what was going on. When he opened the door, he expected a simple task: to step in, quickly turn off the water, and leave. But what he saw left him in utter shock. The floor of the room was soaked in blood. Thick, dark patches covered the entire interior, and at the center of this horrifying scene lay a woman, unconscious. Kim Minseok was standing beside her, shaken and seemingly in a state of shock. He was leaning over her, patting her cheek as if trying to wake her, repeating the same phrase over and over. Why like this? Confronted by this terrifying sight, the building owner, barely containing his own shock, rushed to the next room, where another employee, Lee Chan-seok, was staying at the time. Together, they called the police and emergency services, holding on to a sliver of hope. But that hope quickly faded. When medics arrived around 4:30 in the morning and rushed Park Jiyeon to the hospital, their worst fears were tragically confirmed. Park Jiyeon was declared dead, with the cause of death attributed to massive blood loss. The question, what really happened during the final 4 hours Park Jiyeon spent in Kim Minseok's room, became the focus of one of the most horrifying investigations, one that shook even the most seasoned professionals. Faced with the gruesome facts that emerged, investigators realized that recounting this case would require a warning, as everything that happened in that room went far beyond the bounds of what could be considered bearable or sane. The autopsy results on Park Jiyeon were almost impossible to believe. Her death was caused by nothing less than a rupture of an artery in her uterus. Her injuries were monstrous. A rupture, about 7 to 8 centimeters long, extended vertically from her genital area to her anus. Her vaginal tissues and muscles were severely damaged, and the mucous membrane of her labia had been torn off. But that wasn't all. Upon further examination, her thighs bore traces of multiple bite marks, leaving clear impressions of teeth on her skin. These marks indicated that her assailant had exhibited extreme aggression and inflicted physical violence throughout the assault. The most horrifying detail, which stunned the investigators, was a portion of her rectum lying on the floor beside her body. This pointed to the fact that, in a fit of barbaric violence, Kim Minseok had forced his hand deeply into her body, tearing out internal organs and causing the lethal injuries that led to her death. Such actions were violence that crossed any imaginable limits of humanity and compassion. These details were too grotesque to even conceive of as part of reality. When the police launched their investigation and examined every detail, it became clear that only 2 people were in the room: Kim Minseok and Park Jiyeon. However, as there were no other witnesses, and Park Jiyeon had passed away before medical help could arrive, the investigators were forced to rely on the statements of the only remaining witness, Kim Minseok. The first thing he said in response to questions about the tragedy was, "I didn't know alcohol could be this terrifying. I don't remember anything. It's like a dream." This answer left investigators with numerous questions, and they began scrutinizing his version more closely, attempting to discern what Kim truly remembered and what he might be concealing. In his testimony, Kim Minseok claimed that he and Park Jiyeon had gone to his room, where he noticed blood on her face. He then began wiping the blood, believing this would help her. Then, according to him, something unexpected occurred. Supposedly, under heavy alcohol intoxication, Park Jiyeon kissed him and suggested they engage in intimate relations. "I'm married," Kim Minseok stated, saying he declined her offer. But he claims Park Jiyeon then took his hand and, despite his protests, compelled him to insert it inside her body. He asserted that at the time he was confused but went along, following her lead, thinking he was merely complying with her wishes. According to Kim, he simply followed her actions, thinking it was her desire. Soon, he allegedly realized his hand had penetrated her body deeper than he was aware, reaching up to his elbow. He claimed he only stopped 20 to 30 minutes later, when he finally realized that Park Jiyeon was no longer responding. Kim Minseok's testimony appeared highly contradictory, leaving investigators perplexed. His words sounded like a clear attempt to justify his actions, yet the brutality and perversity of these actions defied comprehension, prompting investigators to ask more and more questions. Kim Minseok stated that after it was all over, he thought, "Well, I guess it worked out. She's satisfied?" As if the horrific event had been a consensual act. He recalled turning on the light and, upon discovering the entire room drenched in blood, went into shock. He described rushing to the sink to wash his hands and then calling for help. This, according to him, was how the events of that night unfolded. However, investigators immediately noted a series of inconsistencies in his testimony. Kim Minseok repeatedly claimed during interrogations that he was severely intoxicated and could barely remember anything, as if the alcohol had clouded his memory. Yet he was able to describe in detail how the kiss was initiated, what lines were exchanged, and even mentioned that he declined her advances by reminding her he was married. It appeared that his alcohol-induced amnesia emerged selectively, conveniently providing an explanation for his subsequent actions. Moreover, the police questioned how someone supposedly so heavily intoxicated could confidently and carefully assist an injured Park Jiyeon to his room. Such an ability to help another person while in such a state seemed highly doubtful. It appeared he maintained excellent self-control while simultaneously attempting to portray himself as a victim of alcohol. When asked by investigators why he continued with such brutal actions, Kim Minseok responded that Park Jiyeon did not resist, which he took as implicit consent. However, forensic experts categorically refuted his words. They pointed to abundant evidence clearly indicating that Park Jiyeon endured excruciating pain and was conscious during the assault. Both investigators and experts found Kim Minseok's claims illogical and entirely unrealistic. Forensic examination presented horrifying findings. Park Jiyeon was still alive when her body endured the barbaric injuries. She suffered unimaginable agony as her internal organs were literally torn, resulting in massive bleeding and fatal shock. Medical experts noted that the suffering was so intense it was inconceivable to claim the victim did not resist. At the time of her death, her blood alcohol level indicated severe intoxication, but this did not mean she was incapable of feeling pain. Even under anesthesia, the body can react to painful stimuli, and in this case, she exhibited conscious responses to physical torture. Park Jiyeon was undoubtedly in pain, yet Kim Minseok disregarded her suffering, persisting in his depraved actions, which ultimately led to her death. As for his statement that he washed his hands and called for help, this also proved to be untrue. The hotel owner was the first to enter the room, drawn by the sound of running water, and found the bloodied body. This raised the question, whom was Kim Minseok actually planning to call? This inconsistency did not fit his version of events, making his testimony highly unreliable. Based on the gathered evidence, the prosecution charged Kim Minseok with violent acts of a sexual nature with aggravating circumstances, arguing that the victim was in a state of severe intoxication and unable to resist, which ultimately led to her death. Yet, the further proceedings shocked everyone following the case. The court issued an acquittal on charges related to Park Jiyeon's inability to resist, deeming it unproven. How could the court reach such a decision? After all, Park Jiyeon's blood alcohol level at the time of death was consistent with the extreme stage of intoxication, which should have served as indisputable evidence of her helpless state. Nevertheless, the court considered a video recording showing Park Jiyeon moving independently, without visible support from Kim Minseok, and took into account the testimony of their colleague Lee Chan-seok, who claimed he heard a brief exchange between them as they entered the room. These pieces of evidence led the court to conclude that despite her heavy intoxication, Park Jiyeon was capable of controlling her actions and was not in a state of complete helplessness. On this basis, the court reclassified the crime, deeming it involuntary manslaughter. Kim Minseok was sentenced to 5 years in prison. However, the charge of violent sexual assault was dropped, as the court concluded there was no evidence of coercion in the defendant's actions. On appeal, which was reviewed later, the court reduced Kim Minseok's sentence to 4 years, citing diminished responsibility due to severe alcohol intoxication. The court considered several factors in favor of a lighter sentence. First, Kim Minseok had consumed significantly more alcohol than usual that day. 3 bottles of soju, an amount well beyond his norm, which clearly impacted his ability to think and act rationally. Second, the court considered the hotel owner's testimony, who found Kim Minseok in a state of panic upon entering the room, witnessing him slap Park Jiyeon's cheek, repeating, "Why like this? Why like this?" And third, the court took into account Kim Minseok's own statement, claiming that he remembered very little of what transpired that night due to his heavy intoxication. The most shocking and outrageous aspect of this case is that the brutality of the crime was so monstrous and depraved that the court found it unlikely that a person of sound mind could commit such an act. This conclusion became the basis for acknowledging Kim Minseok's diminished responsibility. This raises a crucial question. Is this fair? The court's decisions sparked intense debate and divided the legal community. One lawyer supported the ruling, reasoning that such repulsive actions truly defy explanation without the influence of alcohol, and therefore diminished responsibility should be recognized. Other experts held the opposite view, arguing that the sheer atrocity of the behavior should have heightened the punishment, and that alcohol intoxication should have been seen as an aggravating factor rather than a mitigating one, especially given the cruelty and gravity of the crime. Thus, the disagreements among legal professionals that arose from this case raise a fundamental question. How fair is it to consider alcohol intoxication a mitigating factor when it leads to violence? Should a state of severe intoxication be grounds for a lighter sentence if, on the contrary, it acts as a catalyst for brutal and incomprehensible actions? This case demonstrated that alcohol consumption, rather than aggravating the guilt, was used as a partial excuse for reducing accountability. Lawyers and human rights advocates remain divided. On one side are those who argue that alcohol's influence causes the offender to lose control, which should be considered by the court. On the other, many specialists firmly believe that alcohol should increase responsibility if it leads to heinous acts. Among other things, this case revealed yet another astounding paradox. Alcohol, which was recognized as a factor of diminished responsibility for the perpetrator, was simultaneously not acknowledged by the court as a factor that stripped the victim of her ability to resist. In other words, while alcohol served as a basis to mitigate Kim Minseok's sentence, it was not considered as evidence of Park Ji-yeon's helpless state. The judge concluded that despite her severe intoxication, Park Ji-yeon was capable of controlling herself, as at a certain point she was reportedly speaking with Kim Minseok, which, in the court's view, indicated her ability to comprehend the situation and act accordingly. This conclusion stirred significant doubt and criticism. How could it be that Kim Minseok was found partially unaccountable, allowing him to receive a reduced sentence, while Park Ji-yeon, who was in a similarly intoxicated state, was not considered incapable of resisting violence? Can it really be called justice when the same factors are interpreted entirely differently for the offender and the victim? Apparently, Kim Minseok even managed to instruct his colleague Lee Chan-seok to leave the room, a clear indication of his coherent thinking. Nonetheless, it was he who was granted leniency due to his intoxication, while the victim received no protection despite her vulnerable state. In this case, alcohol, on the one hand, defended the accused, while on the other, it was dismissed as a factor explaining the victim's helplessness. This judicial decision sparked outrage, as it seemed both unjust and absurd. When the case reached the Supreme Court in April of 2012, Kim Minseok's sentence remained unchanged: 4 years of imprisonment for negligent homicide. After 4 years, Kim Minseok was released and likely returned to ordinary life, yet memories of the case and its horrific details were not forgotten. Several years later, in October of 2018, Park Ji-yeon's family once again drew public attention to the case by filing a petition on the Blue House website, demanding a review and revision of the sentence. The petition gathered over 250,000 signatures, igniting widespread public response and sparking deep discussion within society. However, the outcome of the petition review was disheartening. The principle of double jeopardy prevented reopening the case, which meant there was no possibility for a new investigation or a harsher sentence. Thus, Kim Minseok, a man who committed such a monstrous crime, served only 4 years for the atrocities inflicted upon Park Ji-yeon and was released. Can this be called justice? In society, the issue of diminished responsibility due to alcohol intoxication consistently sparks fierce debate. Judges claim that strict standards are applied to determine alcohol's impact, yet it often appears these standards work in favor of offenders. And society increasingly asks, where is the balance of justice? If alcohol leads to a loss of control and acts as a catalyst for violence, shouldn't it be considered an aggravating factor rather than a mitigating one? We demand the simplest and most logical thing from the law: justice, clear and understandable to everyone. Offenders, regardless of their state of intoxication, should bear full responsibility for their actions, and no amount of alcohol consumed should serve as an excuse. Few agree that alcohol should lessen punishment. As a society, we have the right to firmly demand that murderers and rapists cannot hide behind the excuse of diminished responsibility. Stay tuned because there's another story coming right up. I'd love to hear your thoughts on each story in the comments. It's always interesting and important for me to know your opinions. Please support my channel by liking and subscribing, and let's dive right in. In January 2004, a young woman walked into the Philadelphia office of Congressman Angel Cruz. She was an immigrant and spoke little English. Immediately, she began to plead desperately. "My daughter is alive. Please help me bring my child back." Congressman Cruz tried to calm her down and listen to her story. It turned out the situation was both shocking and hard to believe. This woman was 31-year-old Rufi Cuevas, an immigrant from Puerto Rico who had moved to the United States in search of a better life. Her husband, Pedro Vera, was 8 years older than her and also an immigrant. Neither of them spoke fluent English, but they worked hard and persisted in building a life in America. Over time, they had 2 sons, just a year apart in age. However, despite their happiness as a family, Rufy always dreamed of having a daughter. And a few years later, when their sons were about 3 and 4 years old, the family received a true blessing. Rufy became pregnant with the daughter she had longed for. And so, on December 5th of that same year, their youngest daughter, Delilah Marie, was born. The parents were incredibly happy, as they had been waiting so long for this moment. 10 days later, on December 14th, the couple decided to host a small celebration in honor of their daughter's birth. Family and friends, as well as distant relatives they didn't often see, were invited to the event. Although many of the guests didn't know each other personally, for Latin American families it was quite usual. Everyone gathered to share the joy of a new family member's arrival. Among the guests was a distant relative of Rufy's husband, Pedro, named Carolyn Correa. She had also recently given birth to a daughter, and during the party, the two mothers grew close, sharing their joys and challenges of motherhood. Time passed, and the party eventually came to an end. Guests began to leave, and the parents, tired from the lively day, went to bed. The celebration was a success, and the family was happy. However, on the morning of December 15th, as Rufy prepared breakfast, she suddenly smelled smoke. "Where is that smell coming from? A fire?" she thought. Frightened, she ran upstairs to the second floor, where thick smoke was already spreading everywhere. Her heart froze with terror. Their 2 sons and newborn daughter, Delilah Marie, were all sleeping on the second floor. Rufy dashed into her son's room, quickly waking them and ushering them outside. Then, through the thickening clouds of smoke, she rushed to her daughter's room to save her. But as she opened the door, she was met with a horrific sight. The room was engulfed in flames. Overcome with terror, Rufy, disregarding her own burns, fought her way through the fire toward the crib. But her heart sank in shock. The crib was empty. The baby was gone. In a panic, she searched every corner of the room, hoping her daughter might have somehow crawled to safety. But there was no sign of her anywhere. The flames were growing more intense, and Rufy was forced to flee outside, barely escaping the burning house. Firefighters quickly arrived on the scene and extinguished the blaze, but the fire had nearly destroyed the second floor entirely. The most horrifying part for the family was that their daughter's body was never found. Firefighters combed through the ruins but concluded that the flames had been so intense that the baby's remains may have been completely consumed. Further investigation revealed that the cause of the fire was an electric heater positioned near Delilah Marie's crib. In Philadelphia that December, temperatures were around 37 degrees Fahrenheit, and the parents feared their newborn might be cold, so they had left the heater running. This, investigators believed, had led to the fire. They suggested that a short circuit in the heater likely caused the ignition. However, Rufy couldn't accept this explanation. She had seen with her own eyes that the crib was empty. Furthermore, an analysis of the charred remains of the second floor yielded no evidence suggesting the presence of a human body. And most importantly, when Rufy entered the room, the window had been wide open. Clearly, the parents would not have left the window open in their newborn's room. For Rufy, this was undeniable proof that someone had entered the house. She begged the police to reopen the investigation, insisting that it hadn't been just a fire and that the child hadn't been in her crib from the start. However, the police were skeptical of her pleas. Additionally, Ruth struggled to articulate her thoughts clearly due to the language barrier, making her case even harder. The police, regrettably, did not take her seriously, and eventually the investigator closed the case, citing communication difficulties with the homeowners. This wasn't a quick ordeal. Ruth persistently sought justice but faced repeated refusals. It weighed heavily on her and Pedro, her husband, who both bore the loss in different ways. The grief of losing their daughter led to blame and arguments, slowly eroding their relationship. In time, they divorced. Ruth was left with her 2 sons, for whom she continued to live. Later, she met a new partner, and they had a son together. She tried to start over, raising her new child and caring for her older sons, but the memory of her daughter, Deli Mar, remained etched deeply in her heart. 7 years passed. Then, on January 24, 2004, Ruth was invited to her son's friend's birthday party. The celebration took place in a private house in New Jersey, about an hour and a half's drive away. At the party, surrounded by children, Ruth kept a close eye on her 3 children, who were playing in the garden. At one point, a girl ran past her, and Ruth felt an inexplicable pull. The girl had dimples, bright brown eyes, and chocolate-colored hair that appeared lighter in the sun. It felt painfully familiar. Recalling specific details, Ruth realized that this girl bore an uncanny resemblance to her youngest daughter, Delimar, whom she had last seen at just 10 days old. Of course, it seemed unbelievable, but Ruth couldn't look away from the girl. She approached her and asked how old she was. The girl was born in the same year as Delimar. Ruth immediately started asking the other parents about the child. They responded, "That's a girl named Aaliyah, and her mother is Carolyn Correa." Carolyn Correa. That was the same woman who had been at their house party 7 years ago. At that moment, Ruth remembered something strange. The morning after the party, just before the fire, someone knocked on the door. It was Carolyn. She apologized, claiming she'd forgotten her wallet and had returned for it. When she entered the house, she immediately went upstairs, even though the party had been held on the first floor. Ruth found it odd, but Carolyn insisted she'd left her wallet upstairs. A few minutes later, Carolyn came down with a pleased expression, saying she'd found her wallet and hurriedly left the house. Ruth had long forgotten this incident, dismissing it as insignificant. But that very day, soon after Carolyn's visit, the fire occurred, and Delimar disappeared. Now, all these details came together. Some might see this as the fantasy of a desperate mother clinging to hope of finding her daughter. Yet Ruth was certain Carolyn was involved in Delimar's disappearance, and that this girl, Aaliyah, could be her missing daughter. She approached the child and, under the pretext of removing something from her hair, quietly cut a strand and slipped it into her pocket. Returning home, Ruth immediately contacted the police. "I found my daughter. Please do a DNA test on these hairs," she pleaded. She was confident that with this physical evidence, the police would finally listen to her. But again, they dismissed her, viewing her as paranoid and unbalanced. After all, it was hard to believe a woman who suddenly claimed that another family's child was her missing daughter. No one believed Ruth. Her hopes were shattered, but her obsession only grew. She was determined to find her daughter. Ultimately, she sought help from Congressman Angel Cruz, known for his ties to the Latin American community in the U.S. When Congressman Cruz first heard Ruth's story, he was skeptical but believed the truth should be pursued. He personally contacted the police, asking them to investigate the case. Unlike before, when Ruth had approached the police this time, with the congressman's intervention, an investigation began in earnest. Soon the DNA test results came in. The DNA from Aaliyah's hair matched Ruth's. It turned out Aaliyah was indeed Delimar. A mother's intuition had been right. Following the confirmation, the police immediately arrested Carolyn, the woman who had raised Aaliyah as her daughter for 7 years. During prolonged interrogations, worn down by resistance, Carolyn finally confessed. 7 years earlier, in 1997, around the time of Delimar's birth celebration, she had given birth to a child of her own. However, her baby was born unhealthy and soon died. Carolyn hadn't informed anyone of her baby's death, choosing instead to deceive those around her by pretending to raise her child. At the December 14th party, she saw the newborn Delimar and became consumed by delusion. In her mind, Delimar became her daughter, and she decided to take her. The next day, under the guise of retrieving her wallet, Carolyn returned to Ruth's home, abducted the baby, set the house on fire, and fled. It had been a carefully planned crime. Carolyn had passed off Delimar as her daughter and named her Aaliyah. During the 7 years she spent raising her, those around her noticed unusual traits in her mothering. Carolyn treated Aaliyah like a doll, frequently entering her in children's beauty pageants. She often said the girl had to look beautiful, styling her hair and dressing her in luxurious clothes. Further investigation revealed this wasn't the first time Carolyn had committed arson. She had several prior arson convictions, one of which had occurred a year before the abduction, in 1996. Carolyn had once set fire to an office where she worked, stealing issued checks to cover her tracks. Her method was to commit a crime and then destroy evidence with fire. Additionally, in 1999, She was convicted of theft and later faced multiple charges for fraud and larceny. When the police first questioned Carolyn about Delimar's kidnapping, she vehemently denied her guilt, insisting that Aaliyah was her biological daughter. However, when DNA test results proved otherwise, she quickly changed her approach. Carolyn claimed that Ruth's husband, Pedro, had allegedly handed her the daughter himself, asking her to raise her. This, of course, was a lie. Carolyn was found to be a habitual criminal, prone to deception and theft. In 2004, Carolyn was charged with Delimar's abduction and arson, receiving a sentence of 30 years with the possibility of parole after 9 years. In 2013, after serving 9 years, she was released on parole. What happened to Delimar and Ruth after the truth came out? Although Ruth finally got her daughter back, life didn't immediately settle into peace. There was a prolonged custody battle between Ruth and her ex-husband, Pedro. Eventually, after lengthy negotiations, they agreed to share custody of their daughter. And how did Delimar handle the situation? It turned out that she readily accepted the truth that Ruth was her biological mother. She adapted quickly and started bonding with her, proving that blood ties run deep. Perhaps at 6 years old, she didn't fully grasp that she had been abducted. However, soon mother and daughter faced a new challenge. In her 6 years with Carolyn, Delimar had only spoken English. Ruth and Pedro, on the other hand, primarily spoke Spanish and weren't fluent in English. Delimar knew no Spanish at all, which became a significant barrier in communicating with her biological parents, even after their reunion. Yet for Ruth, this wasn't a serious problem. The most important thing was that her daughter, whom she'd believed dead, was alive and had returned to her. For Ruth, that alone was enough to feel happy. As for the language barrier, she believed that in time, Delimar would learn Spanish. This case is an incredible but true story, and interestingly, in 2019, it inspired a film titled Angel of Mine. When I saw a review of the film on YouTube, I was struck by the fact that it was based on real events. In the movie, there's a scene where a mother, meeting her daughter whom she thought dead, instantly felt a powerful intuition. "This is my daughter." That scene deeply moved me, and I thought that this was exactly how a mother's instinct reveals itself. In concluding the story, it's worth noting that the most crucial role in resolving this case was played by Congressman Angel Cruz. He was the only one who believed Ruth's words and helped her achieve the truth. In an interview, he was asked, "Why did you immediately trust Ruth when you were meeting her for the first time?" To which Angel responded, "A mother's intuition never fails."